The moment I walked into my spare room and saw my work table covered with someone else's quilting frame and 3 women I had never met in my life sitting in my chairs, I felt something settle in my chest, like a decision being made without my conscious involvement. Not rage, not yet. Something more like recognition. The feeling of finally seeing clearly something that has been blurry for a very long time. My name is Mira. I'm 34 years old. I work as a physiotherapist at a sports medicine clinic in Ottawa's Westboro neighborhood, which means I spend most of my working hours helping people understand what their bodies have been trying to tell them for months or years without being heard. The irony of that is not something I missed after that evening. It still isn't. Shane and I have been together for 7 years. We got engaged 11 months ago on a Saturday morning in November, standing in our kitchen in pajamas while coffee brewed on the counter, which is probably not the scene most people picture when they imagine a proposal, but it was ours and I loved it. We have a specific wedding date in May. We have a venue deposit paid, a photographer booked, a florist chosen, a tasting appointment with a caterer scheduled for April, and a seating chart that already has too many opinions attached to it from too many people. We are not vague about our future. We rent a 2-bedroom condo on Byron Avenue, which is the kind of street that has a used bookshop and a Lebanese grocery and a good independent cafe all within a block of each other, and where on any given weekday morning you will see at least 2 dogs named after prime ministers. The building is 10 years old. The ceilings are 9 feet. We've lived here for 4 years. We chose our own art for the walls, our own plants for the windowsills, and within the first week, I replaced the shower curtain the landlord had left because it was the color of something I did not want to think about at 6 in the morning. The second bedroom is mine. Not mine in the sense that Shane never enters it. He goes in twice a week to grab his hockey bag and leaves. But mine in the sense that it is where I am, most honestly, myself. I have a large work table I assembled from parts I found at an estate sale and a trip to Home Depot. A task lamp with an adjustable arm. A Cricut cutting machine I saved toward for 6 months and bought last spring. A bolt rack with 40-odd fabrics organized by color temperature, cool to warm, because that is the system that makes sense to me when I am trying to see what works together. And a vintage sewing chair I found at an estate sale in Carlton Place that I reupholstered myself in deep hunter green, which was a week of things and remains one of the things I am most straightforwardly proud of in my adult life. I make quilts, mostly. I've finished 6 in the past 3 years and given 4 of them away because making them is the point, not accumulating them. The one I was working on that Tuesday in March was for my best friend Quinn, who is due with her first baby in 8 weeks. The fabric for Quinn's quilt had taken months to gather. The centerpiece, the piece the whole design turned on, was 1/2 meter of hand-dyed indigo fabric from a small studio on Prince Edward Island, run by a woman who dyes everything herself in small batches out of a barn. The colorway was listed online. I ordered the day I found it. Within 6 days, the listing read sold out. The dye lot would not be repeated. I paid $68 plus shipping, and I knew exactly what I was buying and what I was going to do with it. The pieces were cut and pinned on a Sunday 2 weeks before. I hadn't had time to sit down and sew since, but they were on my work table, arranged exactly as I'd planned them, ready for Tuesday evening. That was the plan. Shane and I met through a mutual friend at a birthday dinner on Elgin Street 8 years ago at a restaurant that no longer exists. He asked follow-up questions. At 34, I know what a rare for the ants is. We dated for 2 years, moved in together, moved into this apartment after 4. We got engaged in November in our pajamas. Simple and private. That's who we are. That's who we are. I met his mother 8 months into our relationship. Barbara Hendricks is 64 years old. She taught grade 4 at an elementary school in Canada for 31 years and retired 3 years ago, the same year her husband Frank died of a sudden cardiac event. Frank was 66. He had retired the previous spring. They had been planning a trip to Newfoundland, Gros Morne, the northern peninsula, something Frank had been talking about for years. He went out for his morning walk along the Trans-Canada Trail on a Thursday in October and didn't come back. Barbara found out from a paramedic at the door at 9:47 in the morning. She has told me this story more than once. Every time, I feel the weight of it differently. I tell you this not as an excuse for what came later, as context. Because what Barbara did, and the reason she kept doing it, and the reason I kept allowing it, none of it makes sense without for Frank. Shane gave Barbara a spare key to our apartment about 2 years ago. He said it was for emergencies. His father had died of a sudden health crisis on a morning walk, and I understood, in a way I hadn't before Frank, what emergency meant to him. I said okay because I understood the intention. I believed it would be used for emergencies. In the beginning, the unannounced visits were occasional. Once a month, maybe. She'd come by with soup or a bag of oranges she'd bought on sale at the produce depot in Canada because they were 2 for $5 and she couldn't use both bags herself. I made tea. I asked about her quilting guild, her garden, the podcast she'd been getting into since retirement. I was not unwelcoming, I was trying. But the visits became more frequent, and then they became something else. Last February, she came while we were both at work and cleaned the apartment. I know because she mentioned it over dinner that Sunday, the way you mention a service you've provided and expect to be thanked for. I thanked her. I felt uneasy. I said nothing. In the spring, she reorganized the kitchen while I was at the clinic. She moved my spice drawer from the cupboard near the stove, where it had lived for 4 years, and where it made sense, because that is where you use spices, to the cupboard above the fridge, which requires a step stool to reach. She threw out a jar of me taste with 8 months left on the best before date and a tin of anchovies I had bought for a specific recipe. She replaced the dish rack I had chosen with a different one she felt was more sanitary. I put the original rack back. I didn't say anything to her. I was very good at not saying anything. In September, I went looking for a piece of fabric and couldn't find it. A piece of Liberty Tana lawn my aunt had brought from London in 2019. She'd gone to a specific shop she'd read about and found it and thought of me, because she knew I quilted and she wanted to bring me something genuinely useful. Liberty isn't something you find easily in Ottawa, outside of a few specialty retailers. And that particular pattern, a fine-scale floral on an ivory ground, was something I had been saving for a project important enough to deserve it. It took 2 weeks of searching before I made the connection. In October, Barbara had taken a bag of materials to the Salvation Army thrift store on Merivale. She'd mentioned it on the phone because she'd been tidying up while we were out and found some fabrics she thought we weren't using. I hadn't registered it as significant at the time. By September, the bag had long since been sorted, shelved, sold, or not sold. There was no way to know. I told Shane. He said he was sure it had been a mistake and that he'd talk to Barbara. I said, okay, because I was tired, and saying okay felt easier than whatever the alternative was. I started keeping a list in my phone, dates and brief descriptions, not for a courtroom, for myself, because I had started to need proof that what I was feeling was real. By the Tuesday in March, I had 23 entries. Ottawa in early March is not a gentle place. The snow has been there long enough to turn gray and dense, and the temperature drops over and freeze whatever the afternoon sun has half-heartedly melted. So the sidewalks become these ridged, treacherous surfaces where you have to watch your footing or pay for it. I had been at the clinic since 7:30 in the morning. 5 patients. 2 post-surgical rehab clients moving through the frustrating plateau that happens around 6 weeks post-op. A recreational soccer player with a grade 2 ankle sprain who kept asking me if she could return to training yet. A man in his 60s with frozen shoulder who had waited almost a year to come in and seemed genuinely surprised that a year of waiting had consequences. And a teenager with chronic cervicogenic headaches whose posture told me a story about how she'd been living in her body since about age 12. And it was not a comfortable story. I like my job. I am good at my job. 5 back-to-back Tuesday patients in a March clinic is still 5 back-to-back Tuesday patients. I texted Shane at lunch, looking forward to a quiet evening. Going to work on Quinn's quilt tonight. He sent a thumbs up. I stopped at a cafe on my walk to the bus, got a large tea to take on the 85, stood at the shelter for 12 minutes, watching a man try to parallel park in a way that suggested this was new territory for him. I rode to my stop, walked the 3 blocks home with my bag over one shoulder and my collar up against the wind, took my boots off at the door, hung my coat on the hook. And then I heard voices from the spare room. I stood in the hallway for a moment. My coat was on the hook. My bag was on the floor. I could hear laughter, the specific, comfortable kind that comes from people who have been friends for a long time and don't need to perform for each other anymore. I could smell tea steeping. And underneath it, fainter, the smell of fabric sizing, which I know the way a baker knows dough at a particular stage of proving. Someone was cutting fabric in my spare room. I walked down the hall and opened the door. My work table had been cleared. That is the word I'll use, because it's the word Barbara would use. What I saw was my cut pieces, Quinn's quilt, 3 weeks of planning and 2 Sundays of work, in a pile on the floor to the left of the table. The indigo piece from PEI was in that pile, face down. My Cricut had been moved from the right end of the work table to the top of the reference bookshelf in the corner, a narrow shelf overloaded with quilting books and pattern binders that was not designed to hold $600 worth of precision cutting equipment. And where it could fall. In the center of the table was a quilting frame I had never seen before, with someone else's project stretched across it. Around my table, with mugs of tea and a plate of oat crackers from my kitchen. I know because I had bought them at the weekend, and they were $7 at the natural foods shop, and I had been planning to eat them. Sat Barbara and 2 women I had never seen in my life. Barbara looked up the moment I came through the door. Her face did the thing I had seen it do before, the rearranging, the calibrating. The expression I can only describe as preemptive warmth, the face of someone who already knows the conversation is coming and has decided that warmth is the better opening position. "Mira," she said, in the particular register she used for these occasions. "You're home. Come in. Sit down. Helen, Connie. This is Mira, Shane's Mira." She said it as though I were arriving at a gathering she had organized for my benefit in my own apartment, which I had not been invited to. The woman named Helen was somewhere in her mid-60s, precise-looking, with the competent and pleasant face of someone who runs committees efficiently and remembers the details other people forget. The one named Connie was slightly younger, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She smiled at me with the smile of someone that she may have wandered into something, that she may have wandered. "We're just finishing the block for the guild project," Barbara said. "Won't be much longer. I knew you had all this lovely space, and it was sitting empty all day, so I thought." "Where's Shane?" I said. In the bedroom, working. I went back down the hall. The bedroom door was half open. Shane was on the bed with his laptop, headphones on, watching a sports analysis video. He looked up when I pushed the door open, took the headphones off, said, "Hey, how was your day?" I told him there were 3 women I had never met in our spare room using my work table. He had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. Barbara had called that afternoon, he said. She'd asked if she could bring her guild by for a session. She mentioned the spare room. He'd said, "It should be fine." "You said it should be fine." "I thought it would be." "You didn't ask me." "I figured you'd be okay with it. They'll be done soon." I looked at him for a moment, not a long moment, long enough. "Come and see something," I said. I took him to the spare room doorway. I pointed at the pile on the floor. I pointed at the croquette sitting on the bookshelf where it didn't belong. Then I crouched down and found the indigo piece and held it up to the task lamp. There were 6 pins through the center of it. Not in the seam allowance, not near the edges. Through the body of the fabric itself, where someone had pressed it into service as a pincushion and grabbed the nearest thing that was flat. "This is hand-dyed fabric from PEI," I said. My voice was even. $68 plus shipping. Sold out dye lot. I had it cut for the centerpiece of Quinn's quilt. Shane looked at it. He looked at the cricket on the bookshelf. Then he said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be calm and reasonable, "I'm sure the fabric's okay, it's just moved. Maybe you could work on the couch for a bit until they're done?" That sentence. I have thought about it since. I don't think it was malicious. It was the opposite. It was the sentence of someone who has managed the space between 2 people he loves by asking one of them to be a little more flexible, a little more accommodating, just for now. It was what he said because it had always worked before. It had always worked before because I had always let it. I walked back to the spare room. I was still in my work clothes. I walked past Barbara and past Helen and past Connie, and I stood at the table, and I looked at the indigo piece in my hand, at the 6 pinholes, and I felt 23 entries in my phone settle onto the moment like something with weight. "Barbara," I said, even, clear, not loud. "This fabric has 6 pins through its center. It was part of a project I had laid out on this table. Can you tell me what happened?" Barbara set down the seam ripper she was holding. "I needed to clear the surface to set up the frame," she said. "I was very careful." "You weren't. 6 pins through the center of a piece of fabric is not careful." "It'll be fine. It is hand-dyed from a sold-out batch. But that is not actually what I need to talk about right now." I set the piece down. I looked at Helen and Connie. Both of them had gone very still. Helen had her hands flat on the table. Connie was holding her reading glasses in both hands. They had the expressions of people who understood suddenly and with clarity that they had walked into something personal. That was not their fault. They had been invited somewhere and shown up. That is not a thing to fault someone for. "I need to ask the 2 of you to please collect your things and go," I said. "I'm sorry for the disruption. This has nothing to do with you." Helen stood immediately, which I respected. She began rolling the project in the frame with the efficient movements of someone who has packed up a project quickly before. Connie gathered the loose notions, a thread cutter, a small acrylic ruler, pins back into their cushion. Neither of them made eye contact with me. I stood at the door and held it open. "Thank you for coming," I said, because I was raised a certain way and some things hold even in difficult moments. And then there were 3 of us. Barbara sat at the table. Shane was in the doorway. The quilting frame was still on my work table. The pile of my fabric was still on the floor, with the indigo piece set on top of it now. "That was rude," Barbara said. The warmth had dropped out of her voice. In its place was something I also recognized. The voice she used when warmth hadn't worked, and precision was the next strategy. Helen drove in from Barhaven. This was a planned session. "I understand," I said. "I'm sorry for the disruption to her evening. But I need to have a conversation I've been putting off, and I'd like to have it now." I picked up the indigo piece and set it on the table between us. "Shane gave you a key to this apartment 2 years ago for emergencies," I said. "In 2 years, you have used it to come here unannounced." I stopped, took a breath. "I have 23 entries in my phone. I started keeping track last April after you reorganized the kitchen while we were both out. I put the spice drawer back where it was. I didn't say anything to you about it. I should have." I looked at her steadily, and in September, I discovered that a piece of fabric had been taken from my storage. A piece of Liberty Tana lawn my aunt brought from London in 2019. She went to a specific shop for it. It was something I was saving. You took a bag of materials to donate in October. The Liberty piece was in the bag. I found out when I went looking for it in September and couldn't find it. The room was quiet. Shane said quietly, "Mum." "I didn't say anything about the Liberty fabric at the time," I continued. "Because I told myself you hadn't known what it was. That was probably true. But that's not entirely the point. The point is that something irreplaceable was removed from this apartment without my knowledge, and it isn't the first time something like that has happened. And I am done not saying that it isn't okay. I was trying to help." Her voice shifted, the precision cracked a little, and underneath it was something else, something I had heard underneath it before and had let move me into silence. "I know I don't always get it right. But Frank is gone, and Shane doesn't need me the way he used to. And I retired, and I thought it would feel like freedom, and it just feels like a lot of empty time. And the two of you are right here, and I just want to be useful somewhere. I just want to be needed." I had known this was coming. I had rehearsed, somewhere in the back of my mind, the version of myself that would hear this and remain unmoved, because being unmoved would be simpler. That version didn't show up. "Barbara," I said, the way I say a patient's name when I need them to actually hear me. Not harshly, but with clarity, with the full weight of meaning it. I know losing Frank was devastating. I know the years since have been harder than I can fully understand. I have never said otherwise, and I mean that. But I am telling you right now that this is my home. This table is my workspace. These fabrics are my materials. Your intention to help does not give you the right to make decisions about what happens inside this apartment. And I've been letting it go for 2 years because it felt kinder, and what I understand tonight is that letting it go is not kind. It's just quiet." She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through her expression that I couldn't fully name. Something underneath the brittleness. Something that had been there all along and that I didn't think she showed very often. Shane stepped into the room fully. "Mum," his voice had something settled in it that I noticed. "I need you to go home tonight. I'll call you tomorrow, I promise." No apology in it, no softening around the edges. He held the line. She got her coat from the chair, her bag from the table. She said nothing else to me, and I did not force it. There would be other words later, the right ones, between her and Shane. That was appropriate. That was how it should work. She left. The door closed. Shane lifted the quilting frame off my work table and set it against the wall with the same careful attention you give something breakable. He picked up the pile of my fabric from the floor and placed it on the table. He found the indigo piece and smoothed it once with his palm and looked at the 6 pinholes for long enough that his silence became its own acknowledgement. Then he went to make tea. Loose leaf from the tin above the stove, not the box. He brought it in and set it on the table next to me without asking if I wanted it, and went to the living room and let me have the room. I didn't work on the quilt that night. I sat in my sewing chair and looked at the pieces on the table and made notes about what the indigo piece could still become. The pinholes were centered in the field of the fabric, which meant I could salvage a smaller square if I trimmed carefully. The design would have to shift. Something would be different from what I'd planned. But there was still something there. Shane called Barbara the next day, and the day after that. What changed after that Tuesday in March was that he told me about those conversations. Not vaguely, not I talked to her, but actually told me. What she said, what he said, where it got hard, where it turned, because that was something else that had to change. The vague reassurances, the "I'll handle it." The implicit expectation that I should trust a process I wasn't included in. He told me she cried. He told me he let her cry, and that after, he told her clearly that the key was going back. That coming to our apartment without calling first was finished, that if she couldn't use the key only for true emergencies, he needed it returned. He told me she pushed back, and he held the line. I will be honest that I had not been fully certain he could hold the line. He did. The key came back 4 days later. She rang the bell and handed it to him at the door. She didn't come in. She didn't contact me directly for 3 weeks. That was uncomfortable, but survivable. I have sat with longer silences than that. She called on a Sunday morning, my phone, not Shane's. "I owe you an apology," she said, without building up to it. "More than one, probably." It was not a long conversation. It didn't need to be. "Thank you, Barbara," I said, and I meant it, and we moved on from there. The months after were not perfect. That is not how any of this works, and anyone who tells you otherwise has simplified something genuinely complicated. But they were different. Measurably, noticeably different in the specific way that things are different when something long unspoken has finally been spoken. Shane found a quilting and fiber arts guild that met Tuesday evenings at the Rideau branch of the Ottawa Public Library. A real guild with an actual waiting list, which told me it was functional. He mentioned it to Barbara once, and he mentioned it again, and she asked where the branch was. The third time he mentioned it, she went. She made a friend there. A retired librarian named Greta who lives in Vanier and has very precise opinions about paper, piecing that Barbara apparently does not share, which means their coffee after the sessions runs long because they are disagreeing about it at length, which is exactly the kind of friction that means two people are genuinely in each other's lives. They text each other about fabric shops. They have plans for a joint project. Barbara comes to dinner now on Sunday evenings sometimes when we invite her. She calls first. She brings something. Sourdough she's been experimenting with, or a good cheese from a shop on Bank Street, or once a small succulent in a handmade ceramic pot she'd found at the farmer's market. She sits where there is room. She asks before she touches anything in my kitchen. I finished Quinn's quilt 5 weeks before the baby arrived. I trimmed the indigo piece and used it for the center of a large Lone Star block. The pinholes ended up entirely inside the seam allowance. I did not plan that, and I will not pretend I did. But the quilt worked, and the block worked, and the indigo was exactly where it was supposed to be. Quinn cried when she opened it, the specific kind of crying that means something real, not the polite kind, and I believed her when she said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever received. The spare room is mine again. The cricket is on the work table where it belongs. The bolt rack has all 43 fabrics, undisturbed, cool to warm. The sewing chair is showing some wear on the seat again and could use new fabric, which means I get to spend a weekend choosing something, which is, genuinely, one of my favorite ways to spend a Saturday afternoon. I stopped keeping the list in my phone. not because things are perfect and resolved in the way that stories resolve, neatly, with every thread accounted for, but because I stopped needing the evidence. I had built that list over 2 years, one entry at a time, because I needed to convince myself that what I was experiencing was real, that my discomfort was legitimate, that I had the right to take up space in my own home. Most people I know are very good at deciding their discomfort isn't important enough to name out loud. I was excellent at it. I had years of practice. She means well. It isn't worth the disruption. I would say sorry reflexively to strangers who walked into me on the street, and I would say everything is fine to a woman who is treating my home as an extension of hers. And both things came from the same place. The same quiet training that tells you accommodation is always more considerate than assertion. What I finally understood is that there's a difference between not wanting to fight and not being willing to speak. I had been treating those as the same thing for 2 years. They are not the same thing. They never were. I walked into my spare room one evening in March and saw something that had been building for a long time, and I felt it settle in my chest like a decision that was already made. The table is still mine. The room is still mine. And everyone who comes into that space now understands, without being told twice, what that means. It means something. It always did.